A royal guard overheard a comment from an American soldier, something about how ceremonial guards couldn't handle a real fitness test, about how the red jackets were just for show. 6 days later, that same guard stood on a misty training field, facing the U.S. Army combat fitness test. No cameras, no crowd, just him, a stopwatch, and 6 events designed to break soldiers half his age. What happened next shocked everyone who thought they knew what these guards were really made of. But before we reveal those results, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel forecourt outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists clustered behind the black and gold barriers, phones raised, voices dropping to whispers, silence, never breaking character. Corporal Adam Wade stood among them, motionless beneath his bearskin hat. At 34, he was older than most ceremonial guards. Irish Guards Regiment, Queen's Company, Afghanistan, Helmand Province, for tours. 2 commendations. 1 IED scar across his back that ached when the weather turned damp. Wade didn't talk about any of it, didn't see the point. When his shift ended just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he stripped away the red tunic and polished ceremonial belt, folding them with the same methodical care he'd shown every day for 6 years. Then he pulled on his standard PT shirt and regulation track pants and headed for the northeast gate. Just another soldier ending another day of duty. That's when he heard them. 2 Americans stood near the visitor path chatting with the Ministry of Defense liaison officer. Army, definitely. You could tell by their haircuts and the way they carried themselves. One who wore Oakley sunglasses pushed up on his head and gestured like someone accustomed to being the loudest voice in any room. The other looked younger, less certain, probably a reservist doing the grand tour of Allied ceremonial sites. The conversation was friendly enough. The mod liaison even laughed at some joke about British ration packs being too polite to contain actual flavor. But then the American with the Oakleys said something that made Wade's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. Don't get me wrong, those guys have discipline, but I'd love to see one of them get through our Army combat fitness test wearing those fancy red jackets. His companion chuckled, uncertainly. The mod liaison offered one of those diplomatic smiles that civil servants perfect for moments when silence is the safest response. Wade kept walking, his expression unchanged, boots hitting the pavement with their usual measured rhythm. But the words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. What the American didn't know was that Private Jensen had been standing just inside the security checkpoint, young enough and green enough to still take everything personally. Later that evening, in the barracks rec room that smelled of instant coffee and old leather, Jensen brought it up with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned when to let things slide. Some Yanks said we couldn't pass their fitness test, Jensen announced, grinning like he'd uncovered a conspiracy. Like we're all just for show or something. A few of the lads laughed. Someone muttered something about telling that to Wade's deadlift record, a barracks legend that involved more weight than seemed physically possible for a man his size. It should have ended there, just evening banter, the kind of harmless grumbling that happens when soldiers from different countries compare notes on who has it tougher. But then Lieutenant Barnes walked in, steaming mug of coffee in hand, and caught the tail end of the conversation. He raised an eyebrow. What's this about Americans questioning our fitness standards? Jensen explained the overheard conversation with the kind of righteous indignation that only comes from being 22 and convinced that honor is always worth defending. Barnes listened, sipping his coffee with that expression officers wear when they're thinking through the implications of what they're hearing. Then in that dry tone that sounded half joking, but absolutely wasn't, he said, "You know mod ranges, observer exchanges all the time. Could probably make something official." The rec room went quiet. Even the television seemed to lower its volume. Barnes looked across the room at Wade, who'd been sitting in his usual corner spot nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Wade hadn't said much during the conversation. He rarely did. But his silence felt different now, thoughtful, rather than disinterested. "You'd have to volunteer," Barnes added, his voice softer now. "Can't order something like this, wouldn't be right." Wade met his commanding officer's gaze with those steady gray eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by much of anything anymore. "Just me, if you're willing." Wade set down his mug and nodded once, the gesture carrying more weight than a signed contract. "Right then, I'll do it. No cameras, no press briefings, no Twitter announcements that would turn the whole thing into a circus. Just observers, two from the mod, two from the visiting U.S. Army team. quiet, unofficial. The kind of old-school challenge that gets settled between professionals, without needing the whole world to watch. Later that evening, as Wade prepared his kit for the next day's ceremonial duties, someone asked him why. Why volunteer for something that could only end in embarrassment if things went sideways? He answered without looking up from his polished boots, because if someone's going to say we can't do something, they shouldn't get to walk away wondering if they might be right. Wade didn't announce his preparations. He simply adjusted his routine. While the rest of Queen's company woke at 5, Wade had already been in the basement gym for 40 minutes. No music, no ceremony, just methodical repetition and careful notes in a battered green notebook. Deadlifts first. The American standard required up to 340. For maximum points, Wade trained for consistency, not records, to 150 kilos, then 155, then 160. Each session logged precisely. Evenings were for the standing power throw, medicine ball work on the back parade ground. Awkward at first, but Wade had learned patience in places where impatience could kill. By his third session, he was hitting 10 meters consistently. Every afternoon after ceremonial duty, he disappeared into training. The whispers started within. Days, Wade's actually doing it. At his age, what's the point if nobody sees it? He didn't correct them. Wade wasn't training for an audience. He was training because the uniform meant something. And sometimes, you had to test that meaning when nobody was watching. One evening, as he worked through his push-up routine on the barracks floor, precise form, controlled tempo, nothing flashy, Private Jensen wandered in with a bowl of cereal and watched for a few minutes. "You really think you can pass their test?" the younger man asked between spoonfuls. Wade kept going, down and up, his breathing steady as a metronome. "Don't need to think about it," he said without breaking rhythm, "just need to." "No," Jensen nodded slowly, not quite understanding the distinction but sensing it mattered more than he realized. "Seems like a lot of effort for one comment from some tourist." Wade finally paused, pushing himself back to sit on the exercise mat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his breathing was already returning to normal. "It's not about him. It's about us, about what we represent when we put this uniform on. Who's watching?" Especially then, behind the scenes, Lieutenant Barnes worked with the quiet efficiency that makes the British military function. A few phone calls to mod exercise coordinators, clearance for a training facility outside London, arrangements for observers from the visiting American unit. Everything locked down without fanfare or ceremony. The way things get done when professionals want to avoid turning a legitimate test into a media spectacle. When Barnes told Wade the date, Wade simply nodded. Double quotes, 6 days out. That enough time? 5 more than I need. During that final week, the palace staff began noticing subtle changes. Wade's uniform seemed to fit differently. Tighter round the shoulders, looser round the waist. His step was lighter, more purposeful. His boots were still polished to the same mirror finish they'd always been, but they seemed to hit the ground with more intention. Word spread through the barracks in the way gossip does in close quarters, half rumor, half fact. Entirely captivating. The Irish Guards taking on the Yanks fitness test? Someone scoffed. Someone else said, "Watch him, he won't break." The Americans, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware that their casual observation had sparked anything beyond typical Allied banter. The offhand comment had faded into background noise, conversation among hundreds during their ceremonial tour. But for Wade, the weight of what he'd committed to hadn't diminished. If anything, it had crystallized into something harder and more focused. He studied printed diagrams of each ACF event, papers taped beside his bunk like battle plans, practiced plank holds until his elbows went numb and his vision blurred, ran measured laps around the barracks perimeter until his lungs burned and his legs felt like concrete. Not once did he film any of it. Not once did he ask someone to document his progress or post updates on social media, because when test day arrived, there would be no crowd to cheer him on, no applause to validate the effort, no viral video to make it all worthwhile. Just him, a stopwatch, and 6 events designed to measure the kind of fitness that wins wars rather than competitions. And that, Wade figured, was exactly the point. The transport van dropped Wade at the British Army training facility near Surrey just after dawn. Morning mist clung to the grass, and the place held that pre-dawn military quiet. Wade wore standard PT gear, navy shorts, gray shirt, cross trainers. His only concession to the occasion was the black digital stopwatch on his wrist, a gift from his father 15 years ago. For observers waited to mod officials and to Americans, including Sergeant Garrett, the man whose comment had started everything. Garrett stood with arms folded, clipboard ready, expecting to be either impressed or entertained. The mod liaison stepped forward. No press, no commanders. All 6 events scored to U.S. Army standards. He looked at Wade. Ready. Wade glanced across the misty field at the equipment already positioned and waiting. Always. The 3-rep max deadlift came first. 340 pounds for maximum points. But Wade only needed 250 to pass. He approached the hex bar like he was reporting for duty, chalked his hands with methodical care, and settled into his stance. The weight looked heavy enough to anchor a ship, but Wade had been pulling similar loads for weeks. First rep, up, clean, controlled descent. Perfect form. Second rep, slightly slower, but still smooth, no wobble or hesitation. Third rep, a brief pause at lockout, making sure the lift was complete before letting the weight return to earth with a satisfying clang. One of the American observers checked his scoring sheet and muttered, "Solid technique," said nothing else. Next came the standing power throw, a 10-pound medicine ball hurled backward over the head for distance. Wade picked up the rubber sphere, turned his back to the field, and rocked once to find his rhythm. Then he exploded upward and back, releasing the ball in a smooth arc that sent it sailing through the morning air. It landed with a thud at 10.1 meters, well into the passing range. The mod officer noted quietly. Garrett flipped to the next page of his clipboard, his expression unreadable. The hand-release push-ups were pure rhythm and pain tolerance. Down until chest touched the ground, arms completely extended out to the sides, then back up to starting position. No shortcuts, no momentum tricks, just honest repetition against the clock. Wade found his pace within the first 10 reps, steady, sustainable, unbreakable. By the end of 2 minutes, he'd completed 51 perfect repetitions, his form intact and his breathing controlled despite the growing burn in his shoulders and triceps. Clean count, Staff Sergeant Lemoyne said under his breath, sounding slightly surprised. Wade toweled the sweat from his face and walked to the next station without ceremony. No fist pumps, no celebrations, just quiet satisfaction at a job done properly. The sprint drag carry was where things got interesting. 5 separate 25-meter legs in under 2 minutes, sprint out and back, drag a 90-pound sled backward, lateral shuffles touching each cone, farmers, carry with 40 pounds kettlebells, and a final sprint to the finish. It was designed to test everything at once: speed, strength, agility, and the kind of mental toughness that keeps you moving when your body is screaming for mercy. Wade studied the course layout like he was planning a patrol route, noting the cone placement and the condition of the grass. Then he settled into starting position and waited for the whistle. When it came, he exploded forward with surprising speed for his size. The opening sprint was sharp and clean. Economical foot strikes, arms driving low and tight, round. The cone and back slightly slower, already conserving energy for what was coming next. The sled drag was brutal. 90 pounds of dead weight that had to be pulled backward across grass. That offered just enough resistance to make everything harder. Wade dug in and found his rhythm, face tight, with concentration but not panic. Every step was deliberate, calculated, efficient. But just as he transitioned into the lateral shuffles, disaster nearly struck. His left foot caught a patch of morning dew, slick as ice, and his ankle rolled just enough to throw off his balance for a moment. That felt like an hour. Wade teetered on the edge of a fall that would have ended everything. He caught himself, with the kind of reflexes that come from years of moving over uncertain terrain, readjusted in stride, and finished the shuttles with gritted teeth and clenched fists. The stumble had cost him maybe 2 seconds, possibly more. Kettlebell carry felt heavier than it should have, his grip slightly compromised by the adrenaline still coursing through his system. But Wade had learned long ago that sometimes you have to work through problems, rather than around them. He maintained proper posture, kept his core tight, and pushed forward with steady determination. The final sprint was where the wheels nearly came off. His legs were burning, his lungs screaming for more oxygen than the morning air could provide. His pace faltered in the last 10 meters, just enough to be noticeable. But he drove through the finish cone with everything he had left. Wade bent forward, hands on his knees, breathing hard through his nose, not gasping, controlled recovery, the way he'd been taught. But there was no hiding the fact that he'd been pushed to his limits. Garrett checked his stopwatch and raised an eyebrow. Close, he said without elaborating. The mod liaison consulted his own timer. Within standards, he confirmed. but only just. Wade straightened up, wiped his hands on his shorts, and started pacing back and forth in controlled circles. His near fall during the lateral shuffles had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. 2 seconds might not sound like much, but in a test this precise, it could be the difference between pass and fail. Garrett approached while Wade was still cooling down. "You're good," he said, and for the first time, his tone carried genuine respect rather than skepticism. "But this isn't a test designed for." He gestured vaguely at Wade's build, his age, his background. Wade heard the comment but didn't rise to it. He simply nodded once and looked toward the next station, where a blue exercise mat was being positioned for the plank hold. 2 minutes minimum to pass. No movement allowed except for breathing. 60 seconds to reset, the mod liaison announced. "Then we start the timer." Wade lowered himself to the mat and settled into position, forearms flat, body straight as a ruler, eyes focused on a patch of grass about 6 inches in front of his face. He closed his eyes and found that zone of mental stillness that had carried him through longer, darker nights than this. The timer started. For the first minute, Wade might as well have been carved from stone. No tremors, no adjustments, no signs of strain. His breathing was low and controlled, the kind you learn in places where staying calm under pressure isn't just recommended, it's survival. 2 minutes passed without incident, but the plank hold doesn't end at the minimum. It keeps going until you break, or until the instructor decides you've proven your point. And Wade wasn't planning to break. 3 minutes, his shoulders began to burn. A low ache that gradually built into something sharper. A muscle near his left temple started to twitch, barely visible. But there, at 3.5 minutes, Garrett stopped writing on his clipboard and just watched. Staff Sergeant Lemoyne shifted uncomfortably, like he was witnessing something he hadn't expected to see. For minutes, Wade's arms were trembling now, fine vibrations that ran from his elbows to his shoulders. Sweat traced a line down his cheek and hit the mat with tiny, precise drops. His jaw was locked tight enough to crack teeth, but he didn't move for minutes and 7 seconds. "Enough," the mod officer called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine amazement. "You can drop." Wade exhaled, long, slow, controlled, and lowered himself to the mat with the same precision he'd maintained throughout the hold. He sat back on his heels, accepted the water bottle someone placed beside him, and took a measured sip. No celebration, no fist pumps, just quiet satisfaction at a job done properly. There was one event left, the 2-mile run, that would determine whether everything he'd done up to this point would matter. Wade stood, rolled out his shoulders with methodical care, and stepped to the starting line. The course wasn't designed for speed records. It curved uphill through the first quarter mile, dipped into a grove of trees that blocked the morning sun, looped around a stone marker that looked older than the base itself, and returned across open ground that would be scorching by afternoon, but was merely challenging in the dawn light. As Wade adjusted his watch strap and found his starting stance, Garrett approached one final time. "You've done well to get this far," he said, and his voice carried none of the casual dismissiveness that had started this entire challenge. That stumble back there could have gone either way. Wade looked at the course ahead, then back at the American sergeant. "Still here," he said simply. The starting whistle cut through the morning air like a blade. Wade took off at a pace that looked almost casual, not the desperate sprint of someone trying to beat a clock, but the steady rhythm of a man who understood that distance running is about efficient movement over time. His arms stayed tight to his sides. His legs ate up ground with the kind of economy that comes from years of patrol work over terrain far worse than groomed grass and gravel paths. Somewhere around the half-mile mark, Garrett made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped onto the course, not as a competitor, but as a pacer, falling into stride beside Wade as they approached the tree line. "Not bad for someone in a fancy uniform," he said between breaths, his tone lighter than it had been all morning. Wade replied without looking at him or changing his pace. "Not wearing one today." They ran together through the shaded section, their footfalls synchronized, breathing steady. 2 soldiers from different armies, different backgrounds, different assumptions about what the other was capable of. But in that moment, just running. At the mile marker, Garrett began to fall back, not dramatically, not all at once, just a gradual acknowledgement that Wade had reserves the American had underestimated. Wade didn't look back. Wade simply shifted into a slightly higher gear, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to watch a runner work. The final 200 meters stretched ahead like a promise. Wade's face was pale now, jaw locked in concentration, a tremor visible in his left knee that suggested he was pushing closer to his limits than his expression revealed. But his eyes never wavered from the finish line. He crossed with 3 seconds to spare under the U.S. Army's time standard. Then, not a dramatic collapse or a victory celebration, just a runner who had reached his destination, hands on his hips, bent slightly at the waist, breathing hard but not gasping, shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm of someone who had given everything he had and found it was enough. The MAUD liaison consulted his score sheet, checking each event against the American standards. He recalculated twice, as if not quite believing the numbers in front of him. Finally, he looked up with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine surprise. "Unofficially," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the field, "that's a first-time pass of the U.S. Army combat fitness test, with distinction." No one applauded, no one cheered, but the silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone present realizes they've witnessed something unexpected and important. Wade accepted another water bottle and took a long drink, his hand steady despite everything he just put his body through. A movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. Private Jensen had arrived at some point during the run, standing at the sideline in civilian clothes, clearly having come on his own time. When their eyes met, Jensen raised his hand in a crisp, clean salute. Wade noticed. He nodded once, brief, understated, but unmistakably acknowledging what the gesture meant. No grin, no fist pump, no moment of triumph that would look good on social media, just quiet recognition between soldiers who understood that some tests are worth taking, even when nobody requires you to take them. The sun was burning off the last of the morning mist by the time Wade finished toweling the sweat from his face and shoulders. His gray PT shirt was soaked through, clinging to his back in patches that mapped out exactly how hard he'd been working. His legs ached with that deep, satisfying burn that comes from pushing your body to its actual limits rather than its perceived ones, but his expression remained as controlled as ever, calm, composed, like he'd just finished a routine training session rather than proving something that most people would have considered impossible. He didn't seek out praise or confirmation, didn't ask how his scores compared to average soldiers half his age. He simply sipped his water, leaned briefly against a fence post to catch his breath, and let his body recover with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. Sergeant Garrett approached, his clipboard tucked under one arm, looking like a man who'd just had several assumptions quietly demolished. The cocky confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful. "You finished all 6 events," he said, his tone neutral but respectful. "Honestly didn't think you would, especially not after that slip during the drag course." Wade didn't gloat, didn't point out that he had not only finished but passed with room to spare. He simply met Garrett's gaze and replied with characteristic directness, "We train for different things, doesn't mean we train any less." Garrett considered that for a moment, then extended his hand. Wade shook it, brief, firm, professional. 2 soldiers acknowledging each other without the need for lengthy explanations or apologies. There was no photo opportunity, no official statement for the record, just mutual recognition between professionals who had finally seen past their initial assumptions to something more substantial underneath. Nearby, Staff Sergeant Lemoyne was speaking quietly to one of the MAUD observers. "He doesn't act like someone who just proved something," the British officer replied with a slight smile. "That's because he didn't need to prove anything. He already knew." As Wade collected his kit bag and slung it over his shoulder, he passed the small group of observers where Jensen still stood, having somehow acquired permission to witness the final event. The young private's eyes were bright with something that looked like pride, though whether for Wade or for the uniform they both wore was impossible to say. Wade offered a small nod. Jensen straightened and, without being asked, raised his hand in another salute, cleaner and sharper than the first. Wade returned it with equal precision, then continued walking toward the waiting transport vehicle. By late afternoon, he was back at Wellington Barracks, standing in front of his locker as if the morning had been nothing more than routine PT. Ceremonial uniform hung exactly where he'd left it. Red tunic pressed to perfection, ceremonial belt polished to mirror brightness, tall black burskin, hat resting on its wooden stand like a silent sentinel. He dressed with the same careful attention he'd shown every day for 6 years, each button secured properly, each piece of kit positioned according to regulations that had been refined over centuries of military tradition. The transformation from sweaty athlete back to immaculate guardsman took less than 10 minutes, but when Wade opened his locker to retrieve his spare bootlaces, he found something that hadn't been there that morning: a small piece of white paper, folded once and tucked between his spare gloves. No envelope, no official seal, just a single line typed in plain courier font, passed for '07 plank. No excuses needed, that was all. No signature, no flag emoji, no celebration or congratulations, just numbers, time, fact. Wade read it once, then folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. His expression didn't change, no smile, no frown, no visible reaction at all. Something in his posture suggested satisfaction of the quiet, lasting kind that doesn't need external validation. He pulled on his bearskin hat, checked his appearance in the small mirror mounted inside his locker door, and stepped out toward the parade yard for evening inspection tomorrow. He would stand his ceremonial post with the same precision and dedication he'd shown every day since joining the Queen's Guard. Tourists would take pictures and make comments about tradition and pageantry. Most of them would never know that the motionless figure in the red coat had spent his morning proving that some traditions are built on foundations more solid than ceremony, and Wade preferred it that way, because the best kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands ready when called upon. Whether the stage is a ceremonial post outside Buckingham Palace or a misty training field, where nobody's watching except the people who matter, the uniform means something. The training behind it means something more. And sometimes, when someone questions what you're made of, the only proper response is to show them, without saying a word. What do you think? Should fitness standards be universal across all military units? Or does each role require different preparation? Have you ever had to prove yourself in a situation where failure wasn't just personal? It represented something bigger, and if you had to bet, would you have thought a ceremonial guard could match standards designed for combat troops? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than the algorithms suggest. If this story earned your respect, if it showed you something about what lies beneath those red coats and polished boots, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable people who guard these ancient traditions with modern strength. And if someone you know still thinks ceremonial soldiers are just for show, send them this video. They might never look at a palace guard the same way again. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply stands ready when the moment comes, when the moment comes, when the moment comes, when the moment comes.